Hey, and welcome back to our Romans series. As we're going into week 7, we're going to be starting in Romans chapter 3. If this is your first time joining us, I hope that you are enjoying this content so far, that Romans chapter 3 obviously comes after 1 and 2. And so if you haven't had the chance yet, you should see a link in this video. There should be a card that pops up that will have the very first video, Romans chapter 1, actually the introduction to chapter 1, and the rest of the book, that will help you kind of get up to speed on the book of Romans, just to try and help you have the same ideas, have the same background, have the same information that we talked about in the very first week. And so hopefully you're able to go and grab that. If this is your first time interacting with our content, my name is Jordan Van Hubel. I'm happy to have you here as we go through the book of Romans. Thank you guys so much for being here. Let's go ahead and get started. In week 7, we're going to be talking about Romans chapter 3, verses 1 through 8. Now, we finally are out of chapter 2, but the bad news is still not going away. We are going to get a slight reprieve from it for just a moment as we talk a little bit more about God's righteousness being upheld, or at least that's the chapter heading in the English Standard Version, which is what I'll be reading from most days. As usual, as we go through this, I will be commentating on the text. I'll read portions of it, sections of it, but I expect that you guys have your Bibles. If you're listening to this on a computer, which I know that you are if you're listening to this video, you can pull up a second tab and open this up in Bible Gateway. Go ahead and open that up. Make sure you have a good version of the Bible open for that. I would recommend ESV, NIV, NLT, any of those. Anything like that would be great. You're welcome to use NASB, King James, New King James, all of that stuff. We're not super picky about Bible translations. Just want to make sure that you have a good one sitting in front of you, ready to access some of this text. Unlike last week, this is a fairly short passage, so we'll probably be reading a bit more than usual, and so I hope that will help you guys. I will try to read a little bit more of this passage than I did last week. We're going to answer a few questions, and we're going to talk about a couple of things, as usual, on our first slide. Those things being a quick review of ancient Judaism. We're going to talk a bit about the differences between ancient and modern Judaism, as we've been covering over the last couple of weeks. We're going to answer the question, what are oracles? What does that word even mean? It seems quite mystical for us, and so I hope that we have an ability to figure out what that means. What is a suzerain vassal treaty? Now, those are some really fun words, and I hope that you guys will enjoy learning how to define those words as they come to Genesis chapter 15, and how important they are to the whole Bible. We're also going to answer the question, is God just? Is he just to condemn? Is he just in general? We're going to talk about that. We're also going to talk about antinomianism, and in addition to that, as we can kind of conclude the section in verse 5, 6, and 7, and then in 8 we'll talk about antinomianism. 5, 6, and 7 we're going to talk quite a bit about cultural relativism and its stance against objective truth. So we're going to talk about both of those things today. Romans chapter 3, verse 1 asks the question, what advantage does the Jew have, and what is the value of circumcision? Now remember, we just got out of a lengthy discussion in chapter 2 about the cultural position of the Jews and the value of circumcision, where Paul essentially says, and I'm quoting here from verse 29 of chapter 2, but a Jew is one inwardly, and circumcision is a matter of the heart by the Spirit, not by the letter. His praise is not from man, but from God. And so right off the bat, we need to see here that as we begin Romans chapter 3, we're trying to answer that question, what advantage has the Jew? And we are going to see that there is an advantage, but it may not be what we think. And so as we get started in this chapter, I want to quickly summarize some of ancient Judaism. I am not qualified necessarily to talk about modern Judaism, other than to say that it is a significantly different and departed religion from its ancient form in the First Temple, and certainly from the Second Temple Judaism. And so hopefully that is helpful to you all. In this quick summary, we're going to talk about the Torah, the Nevi'im, and the Ketuvim. If you've ever been around biblical studies, you would know that there is an acronym kind of used for this that's called the Tanakh. And it stands for the Torah, the Nevi'im, and the Ketuvim. These are the Hebrew words for the three categories of books included in what, as Christians, we would know as the Old Testament. And so the Torah is the law, the first 5 books of the Old Testament. This is given through Moses. Then we have the Nevi'im, the prophetic books, and the Ketuvim, and that's the writings, including histories and other accounts. Now, the Pharisee emphasis in the first century, around the time of Christ, was on the law, and so that's the Torah, the first 5 books of the Old Testament, as closely as possible. But at the same time that this is happening, there is a ton of expectation from the prophets, from the Nevi'im, that a Messiah is coming. And so we get to see this, obviously, in the New Testament. But in first century Judaism, they were mostly concerned with the first 5 books and keeping the law in its entirety. And so that's actually part of why they go wrong, is because they are so obsessed with works of the law that they miss the prophecies of the Messiah and miss the coming of Christ, which is a terrible failure on the part of the Jewish people. In verse 2 of Romans chapter 3, the Jews were trusted with the oracles of God. And I thought this was amazing to me. What are oracles? Oracles are the revelations of God through his prophets. These include all of the law given through Moses, as well as all of the prophetic words which are given in the major and minor prophets. That's all those books with kind of weird names. In the end of your Old Testament, you're going to have books that many of us know, like Isaiah. You're going to have very much smaller books like Malachi and Hosea that are going to be, and they're called major and minor simply because they're larger and smaller prophets. And these books should have given the Israelites and later the Jews a better chance of understanding the Messiah, but many of them were unfaithful to him. But we'll learn in Romans chapter 3, verse 3, that not all were unfaithful to him. Of course, some Jews did come to know Christ. We wouldn't have this book if it weren't for Paul and his conversion from a Pharisee to a Christian. All of the disciples were men from Israel. Many of Jesus' first followers were Jewish. However, the religious elite of Judaism broke away from their own faith and went in the direction of modern Judaism, which is a different study. If you want that, comment that below. I would love to dig into that. I know at least my cursory understanding of modern Judaism led me down some crazy rabbit holes, some very interesting rabbit holes. And so I would love to study that. If there would be any interest for you all, I would be happy to write or speak a little bit on that. But it certainly is a very different direction. And if you do any study in modern Judaism, let them speak for themselves. My opinion is, when studying other religions, to spend time reading, to spend time listening, and then figure out, hey, this is a very different thing that is going on here. And my opinion of modern Judaism is that it is just that. It is a very different thing than first century Judaism, and certainly different than its fulfillment, Christianity. And so hopefully that is helpful to you. I think that's important in Romans chapter 3, that we are fully understanding what Judaism looked like in the first century. Some of you may be asking too the question, why Jewish rather than Israelite? Well, not to bore you with all the details, but essentially Judah is the sole remaining tribe left. That's not entirely true. There are some remnants of the tribes left in Judah and in Benjamin, but the tribes separate during the divided monarchy period, where after King Solomon, the kingdom divides. We say in half, and it is roughly in half, but it's the northern 10 tribes and then the southern tribe of Judah with some other territorial holdings. And the reason I say that is because after that point, they're called Jewish rather than Israelite. And that's because it's referring to Judah itself. Now, that's only really important because the city of Jerusalem is it's a much smaller entity in the first century than it was back when you're reading about King David, King Solomon, King Saul. You're gonna read a very different historical context there. So I wanted you guys to be aware of that as we're talking about Jewish people, Jewish identity in the first century. In Romans chapter 3, verse 3, we also get a little hint back. Now, I've said this a couple times that Paul is a great Old Testament theologian. And so here we're going to really see that become very much clear. I hope that at this point you would pause, go and read Genesis chapter 15. This is like not optional reading. This is going to be very helpful to you, I think. Genesis chapter 15 is just a very brief summary, is that God and Moses are speaking, and God comes to Moses speaking and promising him a great nation. And Abraham doubts, and Abraham says, "Well, how is that possible? I haven't had a son. My heir is going to be a servant in my house." And God promises him that will not be the case, that his own son will take his place, will be his inheritor. But then they have this odd interaction in Genesis 15 where they set up and Abram cuts up all of these animals and places them on either side of a kind of a walkway. And then God causes him to fall into a deep sleep. And when he wakes up, he sees God passing between the animals by himself, which is a normal thing, but not by himself. And this is why I wrote down the treaty system. This is a covenant system called the suzerain vassal treaty system. And you can see part of the word that we use for sovereign here. This is just an ancient Near Eastern, which is modern day Iran, Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, Israel, that area of the world. This was very commonly used. And God uses this as an example to show Abram that he will uphold the terms of the covenant even when his people are unfaithful. God walks between the pieces alone, leaving Abram out of the ceremony, indicating he will uphold the terms of the covenant no matter what his people do. And I think this is interesting. The next chapter actually recounts for us a disobedience in the life of Abram. But God is still faithful. And what an amazing truth that is for us to learn. I think Paul has that very much in view as he says, what if some were unfaithful? Does their faithlessness nullify the faithfulness of God? By no means. And he's speaking about how God is faithful even when we are faithless. And it is only through him that we are saved, not by our own works, by our own processes, by our own thoughts. Romans chapter 3, verse 4 is a quote. So by no means let God be true, though everyone were a liar, as it is written. Whenever Paul says as is written, he's quoting something. And so he's quoting from the Old Testament here, that you may be justified in your words and prevail when you are judged. And he takes this passage out of Psalm chapter 51, verse 4. And this is part of the psalm in which David repents of his sin with Bathsheba. And God is the one to whom sin is an affront here. This is in the context of Psalm 51. He is making it very clear to us that God is the one to whom sin is paid. And his just nature is attacked by sin. And God is a just God, and he will destroy sin. Now, apart from Christ, there's this wonderful quote. It's a sad and hard quote, but I think it's accurate, by R.C. Sproul. He says, if we were to die tonight and wake up in hell, we would be most unhappy, but we would know that the fact we are there is just. Now, this doesn't apply to Christians because we are saved by the blood of Christ, and we're promised that salvation by God. But it is very much true that as human beings, we deserve damnation. And we are freely given, mercifully given, graciously given salvation. And what a huge difference that makes in our lives. And Paul's recognizing that as well, that God is justified in his decisions because he alone is righteous. Remember, we've been talking about that idea of God being righteous, and it's all to his standard that we are being measured. Verse 5 and 6 kind of come together as a package deal, and we're going to talk about quite a bit as we go through verses 5 and 6. Verse 5 and 6 says this, "But if our unrighteousness serves to show the righteousness of God, what shall we say? That God is unrighteous to inflict wrath on us? I speak in a human way. By no means. For then how could God judge the world?" Now, there's a ton baked into here. In this section, we're going to talk not only about sin, but about God's standard. We're going to talk about relativism. We're going to talk about relativism's dangers for our lives. And we're going to talk about God's righteousness against the background of our unrighteousness. And so we're going to cover quite a bit over the next few slides. So tune in. If you need to pause to read one of the slides, please just do so. That would be great. Make sure you spend the time that you need to understand these verses. These are super helpful, and they'll tie in later to Paul's understanding of election. And so this will be very helpful to us. First of all, in Romans chapter 3, verses 5 and 6, we see that our sin shows that there is a standard, and that standard is nothing less than the perfect righteousness of God. That is a serious problem for sinful people. Anything less than total obedience to him is sin, and therefore we are all sinners rebelling against the God of the universe. Now that's the status that he has been setting up for us since pretty much the very beginning of Romans chapter 1 after his introductory comments. Paul is very clear that we, apart from Christ, are sinners rebelling against the God of the universe. Now, one way that we sin, one way that we rebel, is in twisting the truth. And that's what is at view here. He's saying, what shall we say? That God is unrighteous to inflict wrath on us. We have this human instinct to twist Scripture, to twist truth, to twist our relationship with God to benefit us. And one of the ways that we do that is that we twist the very meaning of truth. And this is very common in our culture today. That's why I choose to bring it up with this. And in this section, we see the difference between objectivism and relativism. Objective truth means that truth is what it is, regardless of human opinion or attempts to change. That's what we believe as Christians, that God is objectively true. He is objectively good. He is objectively faithful. And so that does not change no matter what we try to do in opposition to it. Now, the culture of the day will tell us that relative truth is the thing. Relative truth means that truth changes according to the understanding that we have of it. Morality is subject then to change over time because our opinion changes over time. Now, relativism is a dangerous game, and you could understand why. I am giving you two examples of French philosophers, both speaking in the 50s, 60s, 70s mostly. And this was a time where this idea of moral relativism was very, very strong. And basically they would say that anything that we believe is wrong is only wrong because we think it's wrong and not because it actually is. And so this is what this leads to. Now, Michel Foucault is a French cultural Marxist. That's just the designation for his philosophical tendencies. There was a lot going on with him, but what he's somewhat famous for is for advocating for pederasty throughout his life. And that is the relationship, the romantic, the sexual relationship between a man and a young boy. Now, you could see how that would cause chaos. And he lived from 1926 before dying of AIDS in 1984. And then Jean-Paul Sartre is a very famous French existentialist. And he and many other French philosophers at the time signed a letter attempting to legalize pedophilia in France. And I recognize that both of these obviously come from the same culture, from the same background, and yet they're different thinkers but they're thinking the same thing in terms of morality and relativism. And so I think it's very important to recognize that this is kind of the logical end step. Not all that long ago, there was an American thinker that was kind of puzzling around the question of, well, why can't we do all of these horrible things? I believe his was human sacrifice. I tried to find him, and I was unable to locate that resource. If you know what that is, drop that in the comments below. But he got in a lot of hot water for that. But if relativism is true, then he's right, and that's the issue at play here. That if truth is not actually true, then nothing is, and all things are permissible. We have to look to God as the utter and most perfect, most true being, and everything that we do is derived upon him. Romans chapter 3, verse 5 and 6, as we finish those verses, God is the one to whom all truth is bound. That's why we are objectivists. There is no truth that he does not set, and in him is all the wisdom and knowledge. He judges the world by the measure of his righteousness, which is absolute and perfect. Even our unrighteousness, and this is very interesting here, even our unrighteousness serves to enhance his righteousness by providing a dark background by which his righteousness appears to be even brighter. Now, if you need to, go ahead and pause, read through that, understand the words that I've used there on purpose, because it's not that he is some evil God that's putting a background against himself, but he's using our unrighteousness, even that somehow glorifies him, because it shows how good and perfect and gracious he is. He uses even the bad things in our lives, the wickedness in our lives, to glorify himself. As we go into verse 7, this is the first of two heresies attacked by Paul, and he kind of leaves them out there, recognizing that they are ridiculous. Verse 7 says this, "But if through my lie God's truth abounds to his glory, why am I still being condemned as a sinner?" And then he just kind of jumps to another thing. And I thought this was interesting, and I think the answer is so obvious that he does not say it. And I think this is interesting. But the answer that I've written down for you here is just a reversal of what he says. A liar is condemned by God, even though their sin serves as a backdrop to highlight God's truthfulness. He's using this ridiculous heresy as a foil to his argument, something that's easily knocked down, and we can move right on past it. The second of these heresies that he talks about is in Romans chapter 3, verse 8. And he says, "And why not do evil that good may come, as some people slanderously charge us with saying, their condemnation is just." This heresy would be called antinomianism. It is the belief that God will cover any sin which we do, so we ought to sin more and more that grace may abound. Now, throughout the book of Romans, we'll talk about it more when we get to chapter 6, verses 1 and 2, and verse 15. It is a misunderstanding of Paul's message. Paul preaches that, yes, we are saved by grace, but that grace effects change in our hearts, and that grace change in our hearts will cause us to become more like Christ day by day. That is the process of sanctification. And so I hope that this was helpful to you as we've gone through the letter to Romans chapter 3, verses 1 through 8. If you have any questions, please put them in the comments below. If you can think of any other philosophers that lived lives that were so horrible, I'd also like to see those, because I did a little bit of research on this, and those are my top two examples. But I do recognize that they're both from the 70s, they're both French. I'm sure there are many, many other options. If you want to go down that rabbit hole, I'd advise, if you start with the Greeks, you're going to see a lot of sexual immorality. That was very common in their culture. And again, immorality doesn't really matter if you don't think truth is true. We'll see you next time. Thank you so much.